Turn, if you would, to 2 Samuel 19. 2 Samuel 19, verses 9 through 18. 2 Samuel 19, verses 9 through 18. And the message I've entitled, Return of the King. If you've read a lot of fictional stories, like I have, or that more popular thing of the historical fiction, which is a fictional story set in a historical period, you see a couple of running themes. And one of the main running themes in a lot of literature, when you really boil it down to, it comes down to the guy in charge is not the rightful ruler, and the rightful king is in exile, and there are people working to have that king returned because the current person in charge is a bad king or prince or president or whatever authority figure you want to pick, and they're running everything selfishly and pridefully and sinfully, and yet if this one king can return, then everything is going to be set right and everybody will live happily ever after. We'll see what that really points to is ultimately the fact that we understand that this world is not right the way it is, and we're all waiting the return of the King of Kings. But tonight we're going to see David kind of give an example of what it's going to look like when Jesus finally does return in 2 Samuel 19, 9 through 18. Now all the people were in dispute throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "The king saved us from the hand of our enemies. He delivered us from the hand of the Philistines. And now he has fled from the land because of Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, has died in battle. Now therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing back the king?" So King David sent to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, saying, "Speak to the elders of Judah, saying, why are you the last to bring the king back to his house, since the words of all Israel have come to the king, to this very house? You are my brethren, you are my bone and my flesh. Why then are you the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? God do so to me and more also, if you are not commander of the army before me continually in place of Joab." So he swayed the hearts of all the men of Judah, just as the heart of one man, so that they sent this word to the king, "Return you and all your servants." Then the king returned and came to the Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to go to meet the king, to escort the king across the Jordan. And Shimei the son of Gera, a Benjamite, who was from Bahurim, hurried and came down from the men of Judah to meet King David. There were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, and Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, and his 15 sons, and his 20 servants with them. And they went over the Jordan before the king. Then a ferry boat went across to carry over the king's household and to do what he thought was good. So as we've been following in 2 Samuel, David's son Absalom successfully staged a rebellion against him, turned a decent portion of the nation against him, and had him run out in exile. And while he was a great politician, while he was great with people, he was a terrible commander of an army, and he made several prideful decisions, and ultimately it led to his death and downfall at the hands of Joab. David had explicitly given commands, no one touch Absalom, or you'll answer to me. We kind of see a little bit of the fallout. But news has now gotten back to all the people. Absalom is dead. The rebellion is over, and David is the rightful king. But he has not returned yet to reclaim his throne. The kingdom has not yet fully been restored to him. So now, the people, those in charge, the elders, are all debating whether or not David should return as king. So the first question I want you to ask yourself is, why is this even being discussed? Who are these people trying to prevent the king, God's anointed, from returning to his rightful place? This is a lot like some of you guys wasting your time debating politics online. I'm willing to guarantee you, regardless of what you've heard, you've never once had someone reply, "You know what, you're right." Ever. And so that's more or less what's going on here, but they don't have social media to insult each other, so they're doing it in person. And anytime you have a change in leadership, you're going to sort everybody that's affected into essentially three groups. The group that's excited about the change. They wanted the old guy out so they could get the new guy in. There's the group that liked things the way that they were and wanted to keep them that way. And then there's the group that sits there and goes, well, I'm just going to wait and see how this pans out. So those that were in the group that liked things the way they were, those that were loyal to David, obviously wanted him back. They were excited that he was about to come back. So we can see why they are arguing. We need to bring back the king. Absalom is dead. There is no other king. David was a great king. He needs to come back. Then there were those who were openly in support of Absalom and were part of the rebellion, including the commander of the army, Amasa. He is still there. He's now the highest ranking official in what was Absalom's kingdom. Why wouldn't these people want David back? That's a little more obvious. They probably preferred having their heads still attached to their necks. Standard operating procedure throughout the whole of human history. Whenever a king successfully weathered a rebellion, once they returned to power, the first act was to execute all the public, popular, and vocal supporters of whomever the rebel was. You showed people the error of their ways. You had very, very public ceremonial executions, and you let everyone understand that treason was a very serious crime in your administration. Even today, treason is a death penalty offense. And while you can't quite behead people in public in America anymore, if you've ever been part of a merger where one company buys out the other, You've been part of those layoffs if you were the unfortunate lesser company. I remember when SunTrust bought CCB and I got laid off and then brought back the first time. And I remember gradually watching all the higher tiered CCB people that stuck around either find other jobs or get let go. So there's still a lot of that in today, and that out with the old, in with the new. But then once people comes in, they're ready to get rid of anyone that might create a problem to their reign or their leadership. Okay, so we understand those two groups. Then we have the third group, the wait and see group, or as I call it, the bandwagon group. They were firmly on team Absalom, right? Yeah, Absalom's in charge. Go Absalom. Oh, Absalom's dead. Long live David. I've always was rooting for David. I was secretly rooting for David. I just didn't want Absalom to kill me. I've been a big fan of David ever since when. I've got his jersey when he first took down Goliath. You know what I'm talking about. You immediately get what I'm talking about. They only were interested in David being back because he won and Absalom lost. In the same way, I think a lot of us are like that with Jesus. We always decide to bring King Jesus back when one of our other false kings fails. How many times have we lashed out in anger at God, at God's people, at God's institutions in our life because of circumstances that we find ourselves in that we don't trust Him to handle? And a lot of times, since we can't lash out at God directly, we lash out at His church. I'm willing to bet on any given Wednesday or Sunday, you can probably go on your social media and find at least one comment to the effect of, I'm never going to that church again. As we nurse our wounded pride and our sinful desires, yet that path always leaves us broken. And we crawl back to Jesus. Thank God for His grace and forgiveness toward us prideful and fickle sinners. So David hears about this. Okay, they're debating whether or not I should return. And he goes and he comes up with a plan with his guys, and he makes his response there in verse 11 through 14. It says he sends Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, to kind of work things out. So we see what David's response is here. The expected response from a lot of the people is that he march in with his army, declare himself king, then proceed to crush what few supporters were left under his heel with a series of public executions and probably some economic fines and probably ruin some businesses and so on and so forth. David, being a godly man, does not do this. And we agree that that would be the impulse, but that would be the wrong thing to do. what do we personally expect him to do when we're reading this? When we're honest, we're expecting something very similar, but just not quite as extreme. We expect him to come marching in with his army. We expect him to declare himself king. We expect there to be a grand ceremony. We expect there to be a speech. Probably goes along the effect of, I know some of you are disappointed that I'm standing here instead of my son, Absalom. I know many of you right out here in this very audience supported him in his bed to rebel against his own father, violating the commandment to honor thy mother and father, given to us by the word of the Lord, which we hold sacred. I know some of you right now are harboring thoughts of rebellion and violence towards me and my men. I can see you there plotting against me, trying to figure out some way to attack me. And if that's you, I want you to pause. Just for a minute. I want you to pause and remember something. I want you to pause and remember every single time I've led Israel to victory against the enemies of the Lord. I want you to rattle off a list of all the people that have opposed me directly and where they are now. Goliath is dead. Saul is dead. Ishbosheth is dead. Absalom, my own son, is dead. And if that's what happened to my own son, what will happen to you? What will happen to your families? Then you should do the smart thing, and you should let someone else try first. And then he goes back inside, drops the mic, and then he reigns smoothly, right? That's our picture. But he doesn't do that either. He offers reconciliation to his enemies. Matthew 5:38 through 40. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand your coat over as well. David, in an extreme act of grace, sends a political delegation to smooth things over, because he's not focused on his rights, but he's focused on what is right. He is showing love for his enemies. What a far cry from the way we run government this day and age, amen? David agreed to replace Joab with Amasa, the general of the army that just a few weeks ago was trying to kill him. This puts Joab in his place as a punishment. This is a huge offer of reconciliation to any and all former supporters of Absalom. David would not come back until he was welcomed by the hearts of all men. And he understood that that could not be forced. Many of you come to me and go, how can I make so-and-so understand this? You can't. You can love on them. You can pray for them. You can give them the gospel. But you cannot change their hearts. You cannot argue people into Christ. But God's grace can break through the hardest of hearts and change their lives. God is not going to force his reign upon us. Jesus does not force his lordship upon us. We must welcome his reign, and our hearts must be swayed by the word of God and by the Holy Spirit. And so it says that everyone kind of agrees to this. And so Zadok in his message of reconciliation and in his acts of reconciliation as well, just like David mentioned earlier, it was easy to stand there and talk a good game. But promoting Amasa, that was huge. That was huge. Then when obviously he's serious if he would allow the opposing general, who would have been the first person executed, right? That's where you start. And then you roll down the line from there. If he's going to offer him not only forgiveness, but a job, how much more will he offer us forgiveness as well? And so all the men were swayed by these dramatic acts of grace. Hatred only creates more hatred, and violence creates more violence, but grace gives us more grace as well. And so it said the king returned, and he crosses the Jordan, and he gets met by an interesting group thousands of men from the house of Benjamin. Everything is settled for a moment. David left Israel months, possibly a year ago, as a desperate fugitive, rejected by the nation, hunted by his own flesh and blood. He comes back escorted by thousands of enthusiastic supporters. It's hard to miss the parallels with the triumphal entry of Christ in the Gospels. David now returns, not because he won a battle, not because someone died, but he returns because he offered peace to the rebels, and he convinced them to lay down their arms. David is met by the people of Benjamin, and this is really important to note because King Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin. You see throughout the scriptures how proud Judah was that the line of kings came through them. Well, just like that, the first king was through the tribe of Benjamin, and they used that. That was a thing of pride for them. That was a thing of respect for them. That was a thing that lifted them up. And it was an insult to them when they lost that kingship to someone from another tribe, a lesser tribe at the time. And so there were people that were still loyal to Saul. There were people that were still loyal just to the tribe of Benjamin themselves. And there were many that were still opposed to David's reign that specifically would have been from Benjamin. Not because of this mess with Absalom, but because of the feud with King Saul nearly 20 years ago. And if anyone stood to gain from David's exile, it's a man by the name of Ziba. Ziba was the chief servant of the house of Saul. Saul had no descendants left, and so everything would have gone down to Ziba himself. And here he was, the person whose self and family stood the most to gain from David's exile, is amongst the group the most excited about his return. It's easy to miss this, but this passage right here, I think really is the core of the gospel when we dig down to it. The gospel is not convincing wicked people that they're in trouble with an angry God. It's convincing rebels to willingly lay down their arms and opt instead for peace instead of opposition towards our King of Kings. God's gracious offer here is paralleled by David's equally gracious offer to all of those rebels, just as God offers us sinful rebels grace as well. And the gospel shows us that people who were once enemies, even as recently as a matter of days, can now find commonality in the cross. I didn't come to the Lord till I was in first year of community college, and it was about halfway through that year. And so high school me was a drastically different person. And there was this one kid in particular that we will refer to as D, because some of you know him or knew him, at least back then. And we both did not like each other, and we were okay with that. And whenever we could avoid each other, we would. If we had anything to say to each other, it typically involved profanity, and it wasn't any of the nice ones. So we couldn't have pleasant conversations, so we just tried to avoid each other in general. Even in like the hallways at school, there'd be like giving the death stare at each other. I can't even remember why we initially didn't get along, but knowing who I was in high school, at least that my half of it makes sense. And so then we would see each other in public, and it's still the same, like, evil stare, and then you move on. And somewhere around 21, 22, I ran into him in Huck Sainsbury. And I was ready to give him the death stare again, and I thought, nope, I'm a Christian now. I have at least to tolerate him. Because Jesus said, tolerate everyone. No, that's not what he said. That's what y'all say he said, but that's not in the Bible, right? I've got to love him. I'm like, God, it's going to be awful hard to love him. How about I start with just not cussing at him? And then, baby steps. And I walk up to him, and I was at least going to be polite. And I could see he didn't want to look at me, and I didn't want to look at him. But then I noticed he had this name written across his shirt. It said, Jesus. And I paused. And he looked at me, and he saw my WWJD bracelet. He saw my cross, and just kind of paused for a minute. We said each other's name, and we shook hands, and that was about the limit of that interaction. And so we moved on, and then we'd occasionally bump into each other in public, and we would chat somewhat civilly, and then eventually we ran into each other at a funeral, and this is across the span of about 18 months. And I went up to him, and I'm like, D, I was a jerk to you in high school. Entirely my fault. I just want you to know I apologize for that, and I'm really sorry, and I wish I could have behaved differently. And he said something similar, and we hugged each other. We moved on, and I don't think I've seen him since. While we were enemies in the flesh, through the power of the cross, we were able to reconcile, and we were able to be peace with each other. I'm not going to say like he's my best friend forever or anything, but we were able to reconcile, and we were able to be at peace, and we were able to pray for one another because of the gospel. This is why David is able to forgive his enemies. In fact, we're going to see he's kind of going to go on a forgiveness tour for the remainder of this chapter, going around specifically extending that hand of reconciliation. Not because they deserve it, not because he's a great person, so to speak, because we've seen how truly horrible David can act, but because he knows the power of forgiveness, and he knows what the Lord has forgiven him for, and therefore he knows he has to go and forgive others of that as well. One day, Jesus will return, and he will reconcile all things. So while you have the chance now, I encourage you, as much as it is up to you, be reconciled to those you may be at war with that may be your enemies. Again, as much as it is up to you, be reconciled to them. And if they ask why, you point them back to the cross. Brother Mickey, would you close in a word of prayer?
Thank you for this. Thank you for this time in your word. Help us all to understand it much better. Each day, try to grow in your word, your love for others. We can all forgive our enemies and be people we should be, led by you in your word in Jesus' name. Amen.
Love you guys.